I'm travelling, but luckily I found time to record a chapter. Chapter 17. I feel like I should have liked this one, but I didn't. It was full of... No, it was full of nothing. Scott had a great scene again. They're rowing across this lake. Somewhere in the distance, Edward can see a red light that sort of... He's gathering, it's like a bonfire somewhere across. He can see it sort of flickering. He can see it reflecting on the water. He can see it reflecting on what looks like rock. He guesses that it's been lit as a beacon for the boat, which apparently is the case. So they steer towards it. The fire is actually inside a cave at the edge of the lake, and the boat can row right into the cave and come to ground just on the inside of it, which means that this fire couldn't be seen from anywhere but sort of immediately in front of it. You'd have to be in the right position because the rock walls of the cave are sort of screening it from everybody. So they land and get out. Scott describes this cave in such great detail. He took such pains to describe it exactly as he was seeing it. He really wanted to get this across. But he put so much time into it that, I just got bored. He just went on and on with the description. The interior of the cave, which here rose very high, was illuminated by torches made of pine tree, which emitted a bright and bickering light, attended by a strong though not unpleasant odour. Their light was assisted by the red glare of a large charcoal fire, round which were seated 5 or 6 armed Highlanders, while others were indistinctly seen couched on their plaids in the more remote recesses of the cavern. And then he goes on to say how sheep carcasses are hung there and 2 cows lately slaughtered. The principal inhabitant of this singular mansion came forward to meet his guests. So this is the Baron that stole the cattle, and he's here with Evan, and he doesn't meet Edward's expectations at all, especially given the surroundings here. Everything about them is sort of very violent, very warlike, very intimidating. But when he actually sees this man is nothing like that. He was thin in person and low in stature, with light sandy-coloured hair and small pale features. And although his form was light, well-proportioned and active, he appeared on the whole rather a diminutive and insignificant figure. So there's some kind of prejudice here. We've seen it before. I saw it in the last book I did too, with The Lover Upon Trial. I do wonder where it comes from. See, he's light-haired. Light-haired people were deemed to be sort of lesser. It's like black hair denotes virility and strength and vigour and everything. And yet, although that's what a lot of the authors say, they still usually have blonde heroines, and very often the most heroic men have light-coloured hair. Then again, just like in The Lover Upon Trial, which was later, there's a real perceived difference between blonde and sandy coloured. Sandy denotes farming, agriculture. Sandy wasn't good. Actual pure blonde was. And Scott doesn't seem to have liked short men. Evan was described as being of low stature, which is short, and so was this man. His whole language is sort of bringing this man down. He's saying although he is considered to be a chief and a baron, and he's the head of this successful gang of thieves and warriors, he's not an important person. Everything in his description points that out, and I feel like Scott's gone against himself. He's created this marvellous setting, and he portrays this setting to be quite grand, and then he goes on to diminish the main person, the one they've come to see. It's very anticlimactic. So Donald Bean Lean Bon Mon, however it is, Donald the Baron had served in some inferior capacity in the French army, and I feel the need to unpack that sentence. Everything about it is putting this man down. He served in some inferior capacity. Scott isn't going to say. It sounds like he was just a common soldier, but more than that, it doesn't matter. Sometimes when Scott is describing the Highlanders, he talks about them being warriors. That's noble, being a warrior. This man is not even that. This man served in some inferior capacity that doesn't bear mention. And not only that, but he served in the French army, which I think is meant to diminish him even more. English people had such a low opinion of French, which makes no sense. I mean, it makes sense to them to have it because the French were the enemies, so propaganda would have built them up to be inferior. Like, why would they even think they could fight the English? But France actually had its victories. Many of their losses against the British came down to weather, not down to British fighting ability. But here he is. He served in some inferior capacity in the French army, and in order to receive his English visitor in great form, and probably meaning in his way to pay him a compliment, he had laid aside the Highland dress for the time to put on an old blue and red uniform and a feathered hat in which he was far from showing to advantage, and indeed looked so incongruous compared with all around him that Waverley would have been tempted to laugh, had laughter been either civil or safe. Once again, I notice for a lot of these people, Scott actually just tells us what they think and what they feel and what they mean, but he's taking care to never step inside Donald's head. It's always, he seemed to be thinking this and maybe he did this for this reason. He's really distancing himself from this man. And I don't get why this man would have put on a uniform at all to impress Edward. I mean, what is it that he's been told? They had some food, they had some conversation. In the conversation, he actually talked about the regiment that Edward is stationed with and showed that he understood everything about it. He even knew exactly how many men had come from Waverley Honour with Edward. He knew in such detail that Edward felt he must have watched them arrive. So they eat and they drink. This time it's whiskey. Apparently whiskey is everywhere. They just drink it straight. Edward doesn't like it straight. He's used to having it with something. He tried mixing it with a little bit of water, but he only had a tiny bit of it. The Highlanders drank it copiously and undiluted. Anyway, food was placed before them and they ate. Donald and Evan seem to get on really well together. They sit next to each other and talk for the whole meal. And then one little thing happened. Evan Dhu, having by this time retired from the conversation and wrapped himself up in his plaid to take some repose, Donald asked Edward in a very significant manner whether he had nothing particular to say to him. Waverley, surprised and somewhat startled at this question from such a character, answered he had no motive in visiting him but curiosity to see his extraordinary place of residence. Donald looked him steadily in the face for an instant, and then said with a significant nod, "You might as well have confided in me. I am as much worthy of trust as either the Baron of Bradwardine or Vich-Yanvor, but you are equally welcome to my house." So that's an interesting point. There is some bigger plot somewhere here, or at least Donald is perceiving it. And presumably this is why he put on his soldier clothes and was keen to actually meet Edward. And we don't know whether this is something out of his own head or if it's because of something Evan has implied. So last point of note, which wasn't really made a matter of note here, this is just slightly earlier at the start of the meal. Being placed at a convenient distance from the charcoal fire, the heat of which the season rendered oppressive, a strapping Highland damsel placed before Waverley, Evan and Donald 3 bowls. I'm going to skip all the local names and description. A sort of strong soup made out of a particular part of the inside of the beeves. And I mention this because in the next few chapters we're going to meet this girl in much more detail. The liquor was under strict regulation, being served out either by Donald himself, his lieutenant, or the strapping Highland girl aforesaid, who was the only female that appeared. I'm pretty sure there's another bit about how this girl is just constantly serving food around the whole place. She's running around everywhere. That's all the description we get of her here. And this being yet another chapter where he's introducing a new scene. This is not Scott's strength, I've realised. He's fairly good once you're in place and the story can get going, but he is not good at describing a scene. He is not good at putting us in the head of a person who is seeing it for the first time. Like a lot of the stuff he described there, the things hanging on the walls, the pine torches on the walls, Edward wouldn't have realised what those torches were made of. He wouldn't have known they were pine log torches. He wouldn't have known that it was 2 cows quartered on the wall. He wouldn't have known that. So Scott's trying, but he hasn't really got the hang of this yet. Just what somebody takes in when they first come to a place. He's describing it as he knows it, as he has world built this place. That's taking us out of the story a bit. And that, I think, is why I didn't like this chapter. But at least here we are, settled in, we're in the cave. And that's the end of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Edward wakes completely alone late in the morning, which is exactly what happened when he first went to Bradwardine Manor. This time he's woken up in this cave. It's an empty cave, and he figures out how to get out, and he goes out and like around a little path that he spots and realises that this cave is so completely hidden that you'd never know it was there. Like if you just happened to walk past, you wouldn't even suspect there was a cave or there was a path to it. Anyway, similarly to that first chapter at Bradwardine Manor, the first person he comes across is a girl. In that chapter it was Rose. In this chapter it is the strapping wench of the night before. We now learn that her name is Alice, and she is the daughter of Donald. This is another theme that I'm seeing here. We've got these heads of households, important men, and they have one daughter. This is the third single daughter we found, who is the daughter of a noble person. Anyway, Alice is presiding over the campfire with food, because that seems to be what she does. She cooks, says it took her ages to collect together the food that she's got. She's quite fascinated by Edward. This is another theme I see developing. The women love him for some reason. I guess he's different, and he's quiet, and maybe they're not used to that level of quiet. So there's a page or two of description about local foods and what the Highland people eat. Here's Alice singing a lively Gaelic song. The poor girl had already made a circuit of 4 miles that morning in search of the eggs. Evan Dhu is off fishing with his main Highlander dude, who was the one who waited with Edward next to the lake. Edward didn't know his name then, but it seems like his name was Dugald. And he has an axe. There's this weapon that Scott actually described in great detail, and I just skipped over that bit. And it's kind of a battle axe, but it's got this little hook on the other side, and they use the hook when they're climbing rocks, like mountaineering type stuff. So they just, you know, like mountaineers do. So their battle axe has this little hook on one side and an axe blade on the other. So it's a weapon and it's an aid in all sorts of stuff, and they also use it to like clear brush. And apparently the Irish have it as well, and I sort of knew the Irish had it, but interesting to see it here. So the Highlander with the axe is Dougal. This is something else he does. He's introduced Evan. Now, Evan is a lord. Evan is of the family of McKeever, even though his surname is McCombish. Since we know him by name now, Scott doesn't refer to him as a Highlander. So if we've got, like, sometimes we've got Evan and Dougal both here together. Now, they're both Highlanders. They're both here in their plaids, in their kilts, in their full Highland gear. But Scott will say something like, the Highlander was seated by the bank. When he says that, he means Dougal. It's like he's forgotten that Evan is a Highlander as well, and that confuses me sometimes, because when he says that Edward gave the rope to the Highlander, I'm there thinking, who did he give it to? I don't know. But he means Dougal, because Evan is a Highlander, but he's a lord, whereas Highlander seems to mean like native who doesn't speak English. Anyway, this chapter is just all about breakfast. Evan and Dougal went fishing. They've brought back some fish. They light a fire and Alice cooks the fish. He just hands it to Alice and says, cook this. She cooks the fish. They all eat. And to crown the repast, Evan produced from the pocket of his short jerkin a large scallop shell, and from under the folds of his plaid a ram's horn full of whisky. Of this he took a copious dram, observing that he had already taken his morning with Donald before his departure. He offered the same cordial to Alice and to Edward, which they both declined. With the bounteous air of a lord, Evan then preferred the scallop to Dougal Mahoney, his attendant, who, without waiting to be asked a second time, drank it off with great gusto. Evan seems to drink a lot. I mean, they all do. They say that. They just drink whiskey like it's water. But here it is, like it's early morning, and they're already drinking whiskey. Partially, maybe this is because they had so much to drink the night before. It's like hair of the dog. That's not explained. Alice cooks the fish. And then there's this little flirting scene. Alice had made up in a small basket what she thought worth removing, and flinging her plaid around her, she advanced up to Edward, and with the utmost simplicity, taking hold of his hand, offered her cheek to his salute, dropping at the same time her little curtsy. Evan, who was esteemed a wag among the mountain fair, advanced as if to secure a similar favour, but Alice, snatching up her basket, escaped up the rocky bank as fleetly as a roe, and turning round and laughing, called something out to him in Gaelic, which he answered in the same tone and language. I put that in there because that's a very clumsy indication of how it's been going. Evan has a sense of humour, he's good with the banter. He and Alice have this running banter thing going on. And by the end of this chapter, he actually confides to Edward that he wouldn't mind marrying Alice. So she's the girl of his choice, and here she is flirting with Edward, and I don't think anyone reads anything into that. I just thought I'd mention it. Once they go on alone, they're actually heading on to Vichy and Vor's place, which is apparently only 5 miles distant, although Edward is starting to realise that when Evan makes an estimate of distance, it's always out. Like he said, it was 15 miles to get to the cattle, and it was actually more like 25. And this 5 miles seems to go on a lot longer than 5 miles really should. But they have a bit of conversation as they're travelling alone with Dugald in attendance, who doesn't say a word. And at this time they talk a little bit about Alice, and Edward says how awful it is that she's the daughter of a common cattle thief, and Evan says he's not a common cattle thief, there's honour in what he does, he only steals from the rich. If he stole from poor people, then yes, he'd be a common thief, but he's not. He'll steal from people who won't really miss it, and that makes all the difference. Edward feels that doesn't really make any difference. And then they talk about independent soldier companies that were raised to keep peace and law in the Highlands, which Evan calls Sidia Du. Presumably Du is black. They're called the Black Soldiers. So Evan is Evan Du, which is obviously Evan Black. The Sidia Du, the Black Soldiers, Vishian Vor commanded one of them for 5 years, and I was sergeant myself, I shall warrant ye. They call them Sidia Du because they wear the tartans, as they call your men, King George's men, Sidia Roy, or Red Soldiers. So we've got the black and the red. Edward says, well, while you were doing that, you were in King George's pay, so surely you were one of King George's soldiers. And Evan says, I was Vicyan Vor's soldier, I don't really know who was above him, and I don't care. At any rate, nobody can say we are King George's men now when we have not seen his pay this 12 months. To which Edward agrees. And then they actually meet. Our friend Vicyan Vor comes on his own. Evan's a bit surprised by that because he thought he'd bring a few attendants, but he doesn't, because apparently he realises that that wouldn't really be impressive to Edward, that he understands English ways much better, and that to come with attendants makes it a really formal occasion, whereas he's aiming to be personal, and that means more to an Englishman. Vicyan Vor is described as above the middle size, finely proportioned. Yeah, everyone's finely proportioned. The Highland dress which he wore in its simplest mode set off his person to great advantage. He wore the trews, made of tartan, checked scarlet and white. In other particulars his dress strictly resembled Evan's, excepting he had no weapon save a dirk, very richly mounted with silver. You see, it's worth having these descriptions in there, I guess, especially if this is an object of note, but Scott just overdoes it. I mean, what does Edward see when he first sees him? Does he notice this dirk straight up? He had shot in the course of his walk some young wild ducks. His countenance was decidedly Scottish, with all the peculiarities of the northern physiognomy, but without the harshness and exaggeration. It would have been pronounced in any country exceedingly handsome. And he's got a slightly martial appearance, Edward thinks, which makes sense because he headed a regiment. He comes across as being particularly open and friendly and affable. Scott tells us a skillful physiognomist would have been less satisfied with the countenance on the second than the first view. Somebody who was looking closely. The first time they saw him, he just seems really friendly and harmless. Second time they'd realise there's a little bit of steel in that look. But Edward is only seeing the friendliness, of course, being Edward. And so on they walk to the house of Glenaquoich, which is Vishian Vor's house. We don't know what it is. They're saying house. I'm sure we're going to find an estate or a manor or a castle or something strange, but that's where they're going. And that's the end of the chapter. Chapter 19. This is an important chapter for the book, but it's written terribly. You wouldn't know it. In this chapter, Edward meets Fergus McKeever Vicionvor. The first part of the chapter is Scott telling us who Fergus is and his family history going back a few generations. It is kind of relevant. Sometime in the past, his ancestor was part of a McKeever clan somewhere else in Scotland. They had some kind of dispute, and his ancestor left the clan, came to Fifeshire and set up here. He built himself a tower, not a mansion house, just a tower, and his descendants have maintained this land and strengthened their position and increased their clan for generations now. The most recent chieftain is Fergus. He's actually young, and I was wrong. That was just my misreading. It did say it correctly. Rose's friend Flora is Fergus's sister. So Fergus and Flora are young adults and they're orphans. They were raised in France in the court of the old Pretender and his son, who is sometimes called the new Pretender. And knowing them personally and considering themselves pretty much friends to them, they're quite fanatically devoted to them and to that cause. There's a bit about how they managed to hang on to this property through the years. They actually lost it at some point because they were fighting on the wrong side of some war, but then it was sold cheap and a family member bought it back for them. I don't know if that's going to be relevant later, but that's the sort of detail that we're getting in this chapter. So Fergus is kind of a real product of his time, as Scott tells us. If he'd lived 60 years earlier, he wouldn't have the polish and the education he does now, which comes from him having been raised in France as part of a royal court. If he lived 60 years later, his ambition and love of rule would have had nowhere to go. But the fact is, he's got the education, he's got some training, and he's living in a time period when he can hone those skills, because until very recently, as Evan Dhu said in the previous chapter, there were private militias run up here. King George was paying private armies in the Highlands to keep the peace on his behalf. Nobody would accept his own people, so he was paying the Highland troops and training them up. So Fergus sort of styled himself a general in charge of one of these private armies. The private armies have all disbanded now, as Evan said in the previous chapter. The king hasn't paid anyone for over a year, and my battery's flat. So although these armies have disbanded, the reality is they consisted of Highlanders, and once disbanded, those Highlanders are still exactly where they were. The Highlands in this era runs with very different principles to England as a whole. In England, if an army disbanded, the soldiers would return to their homes. That's the theory anyway, that people would join the army, do their time, and then go back home. That happened with officers, because officers came from fairly stable backgrounds. They purchased a commission. Being in the army was a means to an end for them. It was a job, it was a way of gaining prestige. It was a way of establishing networks and asserting your respectability and to execute your ability to lead people. But you had a house somewhere. You had a manor, or usually a manor, or your family had a manor. You had a home, and if you sold out of the military or the regiment disbanded or whatever, you'd go back home and maybe find a different career after that, or just retire. And that was the theory for the common soldiers as well. It didn't happen quite so often for the common soldiers because they were quite often plucked out of destitution. Some went into the military because they committed a crime and they were given the option of serving their time in the military rather than serving their time in prison. Others went into the military to avoid detection, and still more were press ganged, and we've all read about press ganging, where recruiters for the military who got paid for finding recruits would go and find very drunk people and sort of recruit them while they were still in a drunken stupor and not able to think clearly. And that was still considered legally binding in these days. I mean, it was an honourable thing to serve your country, and to refuse that service was treasonous. So the reality was that even in England, a common soldier, in a disbanded regiment might not have a home to go back to, but chances are there was a parish responsible for their care. So they would find their way back to their birthplace or thereabouts. But that didn't hold in the Highlands. And when the private army formed in the Highlands, those Highlanders took their fellow soldiers on as their family. So when those regiments disbanded, they all just sort of hung around together still. It effectively created bandit groups. Once they weren't being paid, what were they to do? They were here with their people now, and their people were thousands of trained up soldiers, probably with weaponry, and nothing to do and no place to go. So you did get banditry groups forming from this, and Scott explains this. But one thing that did happen, when you had a chieftain like Fergus, who had his own estate, now it wasn't a very impressive estate, it was just like an old tower and some uncultivated ground, but that was enough. And he was a generous person, and he is an ambitious man. And Scott tells us all this in the chapter, in much the way that I'm just saying it here. So Fergus being ambitious, having his own land, considering himself an important chieftain, his ancestors were offshoots of an important clan, so he could make that claim with some degree of credibility. He just said, "Stay here and I will employ you on my estate and I will feed you." Now, he didn't really have much money. He didn't have much in the way of jobs for people to do. So what he's got is this system where they live the way they did when they were in this private army. He puts them through their manoeuvres. He has troops go out doing training and displays, and he maintains a strong guard for his property, taken from this disbanded regiment who still live there, who are effectively his people. And this comes from his own sense of ambition. This is what he wants to be. He saw this in France. He saw the aristocracy, and they really did have their people. He wants that for himself. So he's come back to Scotland where clans are paramount, and he's sort of set himself up as a chieftain. His ancestor did this first, but Fergus is taking it to a whole new level because he's learned so much from being in France. And he does happen to have, since he was the leader of this private army employed by King George, he has the men, he's got all the trappings of a powerful chieftain of a few centuries earlier. So Fergus, with all this, having been raised in the court of James the Pretender, is a confirmed Jacobite and fully expects a revolution to occur and is preparing his people for that. Now, Scott also tells us that while Fergus is dedicated to the court of James the Pretender, there's a fair element of self-interest in his attitudes. This is not a fervent allegiance to James the Pretender. It's a belief that James the Pretender is the real king, but also that James the Pretender will reward anybody who is on his side when he does take the throne again. Fergus has his eye on an earldom. He is expecting to become an earl in Scotland here. So he's sort of setting himself up for this. Scott wanted us to know all that before we went on with the story. There's a few final points that come up before Scott returns to the narrative. He reminds us that in this time period, Jacobites were not allowed to hold weapons. Rose mentioned this first after she talked about the war that went on when the Highlanders came down, and when she was 10, and there were the 3 Highlanders dead on the floor. After that, she said the Hanoverian soldiers came and took their weapons. That wasn't a direct consequence of that particular raid, but that happened across the board. All the Highlanders lost their weapons if they were Jacobites or believed to be Jacobites. So at this point, Fergus is bound by that as well. He cannot have weaponry at his premises. All he can have is what is required to maintain livestock and protect them. But he's found creative ways to use the weaponry he is allowed and maintain what is effectively an entire army. He does this partly through this system of having only a certain number of them actively involved as soldiery. So he sort of They rotate through their duties in protecting his domain, and it looks like there's only a small number of soldiers involved in that at a time. But that sort of disguises the number he's actually got. You can't see how many men he can call on if he needs to. It just looks like, to the casual observer, to somebody who comes on a single visit, it looks like he doesn't have very many men here, but he really does. It also talks about his blackmail system. Now, this is blackmail, 2 words, blackmail. Obviously, it's the origin of the blackmail that we know today. But at this time, it is protection money. And one reason he can do this, again, is because all the landed gentry in the lowlands, which are sort of the foot of the Highlands, which is where Bradwardine is, in the lowlands, because those people have no weapons, they can't defend themselves against bandits at all. So this small number of weapons that he has here, that he apparently has here, and the large number of men, he can use to good effect because he's the only person who can defend against the bandits. Just sort of because he's been clever, sort of because he's far enough up in the Highlands that people don't come and check out to see what he's got and what he hasn't got. It's a mix of cleverness and luck. It also says that as well as this tower, the tower is a few hundred years old, and it seems like a very basic thing. It is just a big square with hardly any windows. But they have now built a sort of manor house against it. So it's got its 2 parts. It's got the original tower and a newer manor, which is described somewhere here. A high, rude-looking square tower with the addition of a lofted house, that is, a building of 2 stories, constructed by Fergus's grandfather when he returned from an event that Scott told us a lot about that hopefully I don't need to revisit. So it's not even as impressive a building as Bradwardine Manor. But he's a much more important person, and he does have quite a strength in numbers here. Now, they've met Fergus a little way away. Apparently this was just polite. Fergus met them at the river instead of at his house, and now he's walked back to the manor house with them. It's quite clear that he's sussing out Edward in this walk to see what kind of threat he is, what kind of person he is, what he might really be doing here. And then they arrive. When they get there, they see about 100 Highlanders in complete dress and arms, at sight of whom the chieftain apologised to Waverley in a sort of negligent manner. He had forgot, he said, that he had ordered a few of his clan out for the purpose of seeing that they were in a fit condition to protect the country and prevent such accidents as, he was sorry to learn, had befallen the Baron of Bradwardine. But before he dismissed them, maybe Edward would like to see them go through a part of their exercise. So this is clearly a demonstration of strength so that Edward can see. He's making it clear that he's a very strong man with a large force. Then we go through all the display of the regiment. Edward asks how many men you have, and Fergus sort of says, oh, there's quite a few around. If I was to gather them together, there's no need to gather them together. He reminds Edward of the law, the Disarming Act, which prevents them having a defence force. And Edward, who seems a bit clueless, says, but with your force, you could soon put down such gangs as Donald Bean Lean. And Fergus says, yes, doubtless, and my reward would be a summons to deliver up to General Blakeney at Stirling the few broadswords they have left us. So he's quite aware of what he's doing. He's being very cautious. Then he invites Waverley inside to eat. And that's the end of chapter 19.